Welcome to another show of the Research to Reps Roundtable. I am your co-host, Dr. Coach Pat Ivy, and with me is Dr. Ted Lambrinides. Ted, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Pat.
Awesome.
Nice warm weather here for being February.
It is amazing. This is amazing. We might get spoiled. That would be nice. Dr. Reimer, what's going on?
Just another Research to Reps roundtable this afternoon. I have to say that I'm pretty lucky to be surrounded by all these doctors like Dr. Ted and Dr. Pat, Dr. Brittany Collins. Everyone knows that I don't come from a sports psychology or mental health background, but I'm just really lucky to be surrounded by people like you, Pat, and you, Brittany, to help educate me on the topics of sports psychology and mental health. Brittany, how you doing today?
I can't complain. Today's a good day. I'm excited to be here with you all as well.
That's awesome. Tell our listeners and viewers a little bit more about yourself.
Just a little bit more? Okay, let's see.
It can be a lot. It can be a
Or a
lot.
lot?
It's your show. Let's go.
So let's go. I'm a military kid, so I'm what you consider a third culture kid. That's that little bit of background. So I was born in England, moved to Japan, then Korea, Hawaii before moving to the States. So I have that dual citizenship. I think that's what started that foundation of just me doing all of the above and never fitting into a box. I am also a mental health therapist. I have my own private practice and also work for U of L Athletics. Excited to be a part of the mental health and performance team there. Let's see. I also sing. I love singing on the side. I was a former collegiate athlete. I played basketball at Ohio University. So then that's that dual combination too of I had to choose between picking up a ball or singing. So sometimes I would sing the national anthem before games and then I would go play. Don't tell anybody that. Don't sign me up for that. Okay. So that's a little me. And then I'm a mom too. So I juggle a lot. I received my doctorate from the University of Cincinnati in counselor education and supervision and focused on multicultural social justice cognate. So I'm very much an advocate as well. That was a lot. I tried to do the elevator speech in like T-2 seconds, but that
was enough for most people over 2 or 3 lifetimes. And seems like you're just getting started. I know you have a lot of experiences. So I'm going to kick it over to Ted because she said Cincinnati, Ted, and I know that's your stomping ground.
Ooh, yeah. Hey, Brittany, let's just say you get a call from an athletic director. It says, hey, somebody gave me your name. We need to start doing more mental health for our student athletes here. So you go into the office with this person and you're on the whiteboard, and how would you diagram your flow chart or your action plan within a half hour to, an AD, whether it be he or she, and trying to do the whole umbrella approach to an athletic department?
That is so good. So I'm big on meeting the culture and that demographic where they are. Not every institution is the same in their mental health needs and performance needs. And so I make sure that I get like a needs assessment. Oftentimes there's a needs assessment that takes place at institutions to see like, what are your mental health needs? And one thing that we point out is like understanding your athletes, like baseline level of functioning, and getting to know that relationship. So the connection between the recruitment process and how that tailors to mental health, right? It's about relationships. So I say common sense is in common. So that's how I would start off that mental health pitch, in that mental health should be everybody's business, right? It's just not just now a new exciting thing to focus on. It's something we all should be focused on all the time. So how do we start there? Does that cover my diagram maybe a little bit? And then I think that opens I'm very big on conversation and dialogue. So I think that opens the conversation a little bit to expand upon those pictures and what is needed at that institution.
That answered it.
Thanks. Let me, Dr. Reimer, like, how would you pitch that? I know you said you're trying to learn more about like mental health too. and you pretty much said like you're excited to be with us. Like, what do you think the needs are, and what are your thoughts on mental health as it pertains to like athletic directors and sports now being in that team dynamic?
If someone had come to me and asked me specifically how I would approach mental health in the athletics department, I don't really feel like I would have the expertise to actually state how I could truly roll that out. I think my answer would be that I would need to recruit key players like yourself to come and help to roll that out, given my, ongoing education on this topic. If the question was, how would you roll out a sports science department? That's something I feel like I could answer. And I'm sure a lot of those things would be similar to how you would answer that question. Now, with that in mind, I might just say that obviously mental health has a lot of research and a lot of science behind it. So how would you describe the sports science of mental health?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think I'm gonna pass the torch real quick to see how Dr. Ivy.
Oh, I like that. That is a good one right there.
That is.
The sports science of mental health. Mental health, there is a science to it. And sports science, I think, has a misperception that it's gadgets and technology. And if you understand the true definition of sports science, it is the study of sport. And if you're studying sport, you will realize that the mental part of the game plays a significant role. It controls everything. The mind, the brain, the thought processes. Coaches are big on mental toughness. People get that's important. And what coaches, I think, sometimes don't get is that if you do want mental toughness, that you can look at science to help you to find answers. And if you don't want to do that, then find a scientist and find a scientist that specializes on the mental health side. So I think we're all scientists. I think we all play a role in some capacity in mental health. And none of us here have the license and certifications that you do. And so I do want you to kind of drill down into what is that, because I have a background in sports psychology, but there's a line that can't be crossed. And so I guess before we dive into that, maybe we go back to this question and then I punt it back over to you, or in basketball terms, I pass the ball back to you.
Okay. I'll take that. So I'm going to say, I think it's about social science, right? So we need the social scientist aspect, and that human beings are whole human beings. So when we think about sports sciences, we're looking at two identities, right? The student and the athlete identity. But we also have to remember that there's whole people with other identities that come into play. And so that's where I think that intersection of mental health and science and sports science comes into play, and where individuals such as myself, licensed clinicians, see the whole person, and we treat and study and research the whole person, right? And it just so happens to be some of your identity is being an athlete, right? And then we also take into consideration the environment and the culture, as we talked about with Dr. Ted saying, like, how would you pitch that mental health idea to an athletic director, right? It's that understanding, what's your environment like? And is it a stressor? How does that add? How do coaches add to the mental health? And also important to understand in that social science context too, is that mental health does not equal illness or disorder. Again, I'm going to go back to mental health is everybody's business. It's how you deal with stressors. So that even makes me think about a question that pops in my mind for all of you, and I want to do like this roundtable and see, like, a lot of my colleagues say, okay, you're a mental health therapist and you specialize with collegiate and professional athletes. Do you believe this generation has gotten softer? And I'm like, oh, I don't, you know what? I think they're more aware. I'm like, I think they're more aware and more open to talking about their mental health. Whereas when I played, we didn't necessarily have that space. So what do you all think about that now when it comes to the intersection of mental health and sports science? Do you believe that now that we have incorporated mental health and it has a seat at the table, you know, we talk about it more? Do you think it's because our athletes have gotten softer?
You know, I don't think so. I think it's what you brought up earlier, and that is doing a needs analysis of what population you have. And it could go back to this, and you mentioned it, is it the stressors of a coach that may have a conflict with a particular athlete, or is it you have an athlete whose parents are going through a divorce or they had a sibling die? So those aspects, when you look at the accumulation of stress in that person's life, it can be varied. So I think probably more so people would just, well, get your grieving done and let's move on. It's simply not that's not the best advice. So I wouldn't say softer. I mean, there could be situations where maybe some kids, when any obstacle they had, maybe their parents sort of pushed it out of the way, and now they've had to deal with obstacles, and sometimes maybe that should have happened earlier in their life, but I don't think that's the case in most instances.
I agree. That was good. That was a good response. I agree with that. I agree. Dr. Reimer, what are your thoughts when it comes to just that intersection?
Well, the short answer to the question is no. And that's because my perception is that mental health is not just an athlete crisis. It's a human crisis right now. And mental health concerns have started to rise even pre-pandemic, and the pandemic has allowed for those mental health concerns to actually rise at a much greater rate. So to state that the athlete's mental health needs means that they're just softer, this generation is softer, I think that is a bit myopic, because you're just looking at that athlete, but you may not be looking at your family members, your siblings, your parents, your own children, your friends, and just the general community and society in general. But I think it's pretty well known now, if you're paying close enough attention, which I have, thanks to people like Pat and you over the past year and a half. But this is a pretty major issue, and I might just spin this a little bit though to make one point. Mm-hmm. One thing I've contemplated, and I'll throw this over to Dr. Ivy, because when we talk about softer now, maybe the opposite of mentally soft would be mental toughness. But one thing that seems to be present, and I don't have a lot of evidence for this, but like our society may be a little bit more sedentary than it used to be. There's a lot more video games, a lot more screen time, things like that. There's other forms of entertainment. It's not outside play and playing sports and being active anymore. A lot of internet, a lot of computers, and there's more childhood obesity and probably greater obesity in society in general. But there's a chance that maybe there is less physical activity happening when kids are growing up. And I just want to tie that and throw this question, your question, and add to Dr. Ivy. In what way does physical activity contribute to mental toughness or the lack thereof? And that one's for Pat.
That's a good one.
So I'll get to that question and say something first before I get to that. The coping mechanisms we had when I was a student athlete are different than what they have now. There are things that we did prior to cell phone and cameras being available, camera, video feed. There are things that we did to cope that was probably very similar to how our coaches coped. And those things are a lot of those things are counterproductive, but those were, we quote unquote went to blow off some steam. Like, how do athletes get to blow off steam now? Ted, I see you laughing, trying to hold it together, but you know what I'm talking about. So that was seen probably as a sign of, someone who was kind of tough, a tough way of dealing with the issues, how you went to go blow off steam that may have ended in some sort of fighting or something like that at the end of the night. That was tough. Well, our athletes don't really have those options that we had. And we didn't know any better. We didn't know any better. If you were stressed out, you found a way to let the stress go. You went to go blow off some steam, and it wasn't going to show up on the internet the next day or even that night. So that's one thing. Now, to advance to your question, and I might need to be reminded, Dr. Reimer, because I was deep on that. I had to go deep in my head on that one.
So Brittany had asked, like, if we perceive that today's youth generation is softer, and my answer to that was no. But another observation is that maybe as a society we are more sedentary. There's a lot more additional activities. So there is a perception that physical activity and hard physical activity correlates to, say, mental toughness. And so my question to you was that if kids are coming up potentially less active than perhaps earlier generations, could that correspond to a lack of mental toughness, so to speak?
Yeah, and this is not the first video game generation. You go back a few decades, there was a video game generation. There's maybe before that, it was the air conditioned generation. So there's always seemed to be a new generation that the older generation looks at and says, you didn't walk as far as I did to school. It wasn't as cold when I went to school. And there always seems to be that when I had it, it was tougher than how you have it. Mm-hmm. And there are certain advancements that we have that allow for more comfort. The pandemic did take away some of our physical activity. So yeah, it probably did perpetuate some of the sedentariness of what athletes had to do and students had to do when they couldn't go play with each other. There may be some of that, but the issue that I take is people that are trying to force mental toughness on athletes that need to be properly reintroduced to physical activity if there was some setback. Is that what you're getting at, Dr. Reimer? So if that's the case, then Dr. Collins, how do you, and I'm sure you've seen some of this in your private practice because you never would have see anything like this in the collegiate setting. So how did you deal with the student, the parents, the coaches, the teachers? Like, how does all of those people come together?
That's good. So then I go back to Bronfenbrenner's ecological perspective and the layers, right, of each person's identity. And so you think about the stressors with each, even family therapy, right? Family therapy and thinking about your family dynamic. Or I think it's just about getting the whole story overall of that person that's in front of you, and then seeing how you can meet that person where they are. Like, were you the baby in your family, right? Or were you the only child? So let's see how that transfers into this team dynamic that you're on too, right? If you were an only child, it might be hard for you to connect with other teammates. You've learned and developed on how to be more introverted, and you learn how to deal with stress on your own, right? Whereas you come into a team dynamic, You're thinking about, oh, I have to really engage and interact with people and be open to a coach coaching me, right? So that's different. So that's just one example of layers that you have to take into consideration. Oftentimes I do have parent consultations or coaching consultations where I also talk with them and teach them skills to assist my client, right? Because ultimately it's about my client. And then it's who's in that client space as support. And it's a team that, it's a team effort. It's about all working together. Again, mental health is everybody's business. So it's not just come see a therapist and it's a quick fix in 50 minutes or an hour session. And then I send you back into the environment in which stresses you, right? So you can't just put a Band-Aid on it. It's about collaboration, consulting, and a lot of psychoeducation on teaching those skills as much as you can. And I think that's huge. And you mentioned the pandemic too. And I think it's huge that I don't know, I'm thinking about even 9/11, where I was when 9/11 happened, and each generation had something. But the pandemic even, and then ongoing racial social injustices, and how that adds another layer of stressors as well, and how that impacts mental health in the environment. So I'm thinking about and processing even that now, 2020, and how we're still very much in a pandemic, and how everybody was forced to pause and stop and think about things, right? And so I think that's where it makes people more aware in that we have to readjust. And anxiety is an all-time high. Everybody has anxiety. Everybody has a little bit of anxiety. And I think it's just teaching too that having a little bit of anxiety is not bad, but if it consumes you or to where you feel like you can't leave the house or you can't function, or as we talk about in sports science too, perform, because now all of a sudden you're back where we used to have fans in the stands, then we took fans out of the stands, and now we're back again. That's a shock to the system, right? So how does that play a role in sports sciences too? I think that's a good question to ask. And I'm going to get your expertise on that as I talk about the intersection of mental health and sports sciences as we come back and then think about sleep, how that was disturbed. Ernie, I'm gonna come to you with sleep too, as we talk about just how much people are anxious and what if something else happens? What if, what's next? So how does sports science play a role with that? And I think that's where we see a lot of that intersection of mental health too. So Ernie, what do you see with that now and how that plays a role?
Well, I think that the start of the scientific process is a question. And if we identify that sleep is a concern, which by the way, for the record, I do believe that sleep is a concern, and it's one of the X factors or one of the overlooked factors affecting our student athletes and all athletes for that matter. But I think it starts with a question. And when that question is answered, it's our job to go and try to find those answers. Now, we currently don't do a lot of work around sleep. We don't collect much data around sleep. We do provide a little bit of education on sleep. One casual observation I've made, and this spans 2 institutions now, is that sports who consistently train on a regular basis very early in the morning tend to have higher rates of mental health concerns. And there is a relationship between sleep deficiencies and mental health concerns. And so if we could get a hold of this a little bit more, there actually could be reason to suggest that maybe once in a while we need to let the kids sleep in a little bit more. Here's the thing. We can't control what time they go to bed, but we can definitely control what time they get out of bed. And in some ways, if we identify that sleep is related to mental health concerns, and if we're starting to observe that those early morning participants tend to have higher rates, then maybe there's a suggestion to let them sleep once in a while.
To that, I say I'm all about the nap ministry too. I call it the nap ministry, and I feel like adults need it more than kids. So I'm
So-
all about the nap ministry, I'll
Yeah.
say. My favorite place on campus as a student athlete was my bed, so I could take
I have a
nap.
question for the NAP ministry then. If a student athlete or a coach or anyone else wanted advice on napping, what advice would you give someone on how to take naps or, just nap behavior?
Ooh, that's a good, you know what, that's good, and I'm gonna shift to Dr. Ivy here in a minute too, because I know he was getting ready to say something. I think I cut him off, so I apologize. So now we have sleep pods in locker rooms, right? I think they're like, or nap pod, like where you cots. I did not have that, and I wish I did. I think just a 20-minute power nap would have done me some good. So I really want to just, Dr. Ivy, what do you think? As we now have even in the locker rooms, where you can take naps, what are your thoughts on that? And even as an athlete, did you get to take a nap at any point in time, and did it help you function?
Absolutely. And I think I would plan it just like I planned lunch. Planning a nap is just as important as planning lunch. Even if you can find some time to split your lunch hour with eating and then just closing your eyes for a few minutes, even if it's in your car somewhere. I think it's just very helpful to be able to reset during the middle of the day. I was going to ask Ted, because he studies a lot of the literature, and as you're studying the literature, Ted, has there been a shift recently? Has there been a shift in the research that is being done in the mental health space and the sleep space? Where was it, maybe 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and where is it now?
Oh, I think there's a lot more research on that area. And Ernie sort of touched upon it, is the information's there, but sometimes coaches are creatures of habit of, no, this is the schedule we're going to have. We're going to have a 5:30 group in the morning. and then you also hear those people say, we think sleep's real important. Well, if sleep's real important, then don't start workouts at 5:30 in the morning. So I think it's a question of the literature's there. It's conveying it to a coach who sort of said, well, listen, I've been successful, and this is a schedule we've used for the last 15 years. So why should I change now? Now, Ernie, since you have a lot of communication with the coaches, what's a strategy to get somebody that says, hey, I've been successful, been doing this, haven't had any problems, or they've maybe ignored some of the problems that have existed, or perhaps they could actually get better results? What are some strategies to communicate that to a coach?
Good question. It's funny. I was just talking with someone about that today. My PhD chair once said that his goal as a graduate student faculty advisor is to be able to just throw things out that would land in front of the student so that they would suddenly discover it on their own without him saying, hey, you should do this, but trying to help them discover these things. And I'm expressing it that way because sometimes you can just close the door and there will always be a barrier if you come on too strongly with certain things. So I suppose my strategy would be to maybe just put some pieces out there that they may discover, and then get to a point where they might want to ask about it and ask that first question and show that interest authentically for the first time. Because I believe that if I went to a swim coach, or because obviously swimming is one of those sports that's always really early, we know that. There's a lot of other sports, but if I went right full on to them and said, hey, we got to stop swimming early, I don't think that that's going to go over too well. So they kind of have to discover it on their own. and then start asking questions and inquiring, and then you take advantage of that opportunity to dive into that topic and see if there's some better solutions.
It was Galileo. What create a situation whereby the student teaches themselves.
Thank you. Maybe that's what my chair was actually trying to do.
Exactly. Now, Brittany, got a question.
Okay.
And there's usually been some unfortunate situations where you have the athlete that's a perfectionist.
Mm.
You know, I have to get straight A's. I have to be the best. And they're pleasers. They got to please everybody in their family.
Yes.
And sometimes, unfortunately, we've seen them just jump off the top of the building because the stress gets too much. What are some strategies if you let's just say you're, to look at what are some of the red flags that, that maybe are precursors for that?
So I would, that's a great question. And it is unfortunate because most athletes are perfectionists, or they've been raised or developed in that environment where they feel they have to be perfect all the time. So providing a space where you don't have to be perfect is a start. Providing a space where they can be human beings, as we first started talking about, and not just the student athlete identity. It's like you're so much more than that, so that they can see that their worth is not connected to their performance, and who they are as a person is not connected to their performance. So allowing them to have that safe space to unpack that is first. I'll tell you, one of the biggest things, even as a doc student, because I went through that, I call myself a recovering perfectionist. I'm recovering from that as a former athlete. Even as my multiple identities as a Black woman and a former athlete, it's another level of perfectionism there that there's no room to mess up ever. And I had to teach myself, like, no, you're human, you're a human being. And so even having that vulnerability in those spaces with individuals to say, it's okay if you're not okay. And I had somebody tell me that in my doctoral journey, like I wasn't allowed to be, the irony of getting a doctorate in the mental health field and having to work through mental health on your own, that's self-work, right? I was like, I'm okay. And my colleague was like, it's okay if you're not. And it took me back for a minute. And I paused and was like, oh my gosh, nobody's ever told me that. It is okay if I'm not. It's okay. Like, I'm doing a lot. So I think that is a start. And then just watching body language, watching individuals disconnect or shut down or beat themselves up, but building them back up. What I do is empowering. Even when we go to practices, things like that, we do check-ins just to see how they're functioning even at practice. Like, so things like that. That's one of the big things.
Yeah, Brittany, I have a question. So I want to help the parents out for a few minutes here. For those that, because they saw their young person from the time they were born, or, parent, guardian, someone that is helping to raise a young person. And obviously there's a lot of development that happens from the infant stage through the preteen, teen, and then there are the hormones that sometimes it gets, all right, well, those are just hormones. That's why that's why my young person is going through a rough time. Okay, help us to dissect what could be happening, what you've seen. How do you help a parent to be more aware of challenges that are happening that might not just be physiological, where it's hormonal, and how does that affect the mental ability, the mental state of a young person?
Ooh, that's good. I think we're all of us are sitting here like, if you could see all of our faces sitting here and looking at this, like, this is that's good. So I think it goes back to the parent, right? As a mom myself, oftentimes parents look at the children as an extension of themselves. So we have to disconnect that to say, like, this is not a me thing. I have to show up for my child and separate that. That's the first thing, right? It's like, what do you need? So even as we think about science, genetics, there's a lot that goes into our children, and they don't necessarily, right, get all of the DNA or the stuff. Some of it's environmental. We think about too, nutrition and food, how it's changed now, right? I am 6'2". My mom is 5'7". My dad was 5'9", 5'10". Okay, me and my brother both ended up 6. So I'm like, something's in the milk, Mom. What is going on? Like something's in the milk. So things like that, even when we think about cycles, when we think about like cycles, like women starting their cycles earlier and hormones. And so we look at all that. All of it is not just the environment that they're in, but an environment outside of the home as well. And so you really have to just meet each child that you have, especially if you have more than one, and each personality, each unique gifts, skill sets, and then meet that where they are, and be okay to say like, okay, sometimes I might need to get outside help, and that's okay. Someone I can trust, someone I can support to say, what do you need? Again, I'm going to go back to common sense is not common. It's about communication. It's about sitting down and actually having a conversation with your child, adolescent, young adult. And even if they're able to say, I don't know what I need, just sitting with them in that space to say, that's okay, we'll figure it out. So it's sometimes that, and it doesn't seem like, it seems harder than what it is, but it really is. Like, let's just sit down and I'm going to show up for you right here. And I notice something is off, or you're a little stressed, or how can I help? Am I missing something? Just to even acknowledge that you see it. That's huge. And not taking defense, right? To say like, oh, this is not a me thing. This is about you. I think that's huge. Empathy goes along with, I think we talked about empathy a lot. Empathy and compassion. And that's one question I had too, is like, can you teach empathy and compassion? Because a lot, like coaches, parents. Ted, what are your thoughts? Are there studies on empathy or compassion and teaching that?
I would think it would, like you say, it would go back to maybe environmental. If they're seeing that expressed, then they can, I don't know if it's anything they can read and learn. I think they have to see it in action. And if they see a coach that lacks that, that could add to stress. But if they see a parent or a coach that is actually putting those into practice, then I think they can acquire some of those traits.
That's good. But I that as a social scientist, as you said, in mental health, that's shifting from surviving to thriving, getting out of survival mode. So we talked about survival mode a lot. So a lot of our athletes sometimes with their parents or with their coaches end up being in survival mode instead of thriving. And so empathy and compassion, what I hear you saying too, is helps shift that, not in that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Dr. Ivy, what are you thinking when it comes to that?
Can you go back and explain fight, flight, freeze, or fawn really quick?
Oh, I sure can. So those are the trauma responses. So I actually, research uses the words fight, flight, freeze, or response, or fight, flight, freeze, or fawn as a trauma response when you're in survival mode, right? It's that frontal lobe, that amygdala, the button is stuck. And so again, it goes back to that anxiety or that fear, that adrenaline that goes up. We naturally have that. Our body is supposed to signal that something is off, but it's not supposed to be on all of the time. And so individuals that are going through trauma, they usually go into a fight response where you might see maybe an athlete that's trauma, they get defensive, right? And you see they're getting irritable. And so that's the fight. The flight is they just avoid it and run, and they stop talking. They won't answer your phone calls, nothing. They just disconnect. It's like, I'm flight, I'm gone. Freezing is like, you might see like a brain fog and a deer in headlights just staring at you, and they disconnect. Right. And then fawn is just submitting and say whatever, like the people pleaser. We talked about that. Perfectionist, the people pleaser, oftentimes that's the response. I call that freeze, submit, fawn and submit, actually. I call it similar, very similar. just submitting to the environment that you're in. Until you get out of that environment where you're desensitized or numb, and then you're like, you wake up because you're like, oh, I don't have to be in survival mode anymore. This is different. So that's that fight, flight, freeze, fawn or submit.
I remember when I shifted from that survival mode, being from inner city Detroit, lots of violence, lots of trauma, not knowing that's what it was, because it was just, that is what that a lot of that is what made me a good football player. A lot of those being able to channel my aggression and do it in a constructive way on the football field, that was powerful. But I remember I think I probably had been at college in a small college town, Columbia, Missouri, compared to Detroit, Michigan, for 2 years. And I remember thinking, you know what? I think I might like it here. I don't have to watch my back. It took me 2 years to realize I don't have to watch my back. And I think because we used to keep the apartment unlocked, like, no one's locking the apartment. Well, it's not a problem. It's not an issue. And now there are certain areas that you should be locking the apartment in Columbia, Missouri. Now, so I'm not saying that, but where we were, it was just a bunch of college students. But it took me 2 years to realize I like this. I don't have to look over my back. But then learning what happens to different parts of your brain to be able to survive. Like, I believe your amygdala actually grows when you are in those sorts of environments. So coming to an environment with a supercharged, overgrown amygdala, and being in an environment where I don't need that, I just need my backpack and my books, was shocking. I went through because it wasn't just me. My other 2 roommates were from inner city Detroit too. So we constantly were feeding each other trauma stories and survival memories. And then the reality is, like, no, we get up, we go to workouts, we go sit in the classroom, we open up books, we pull out a calculator, we take notes, and then we go eat and go practice and go to sleep and go do it again. That's what we do, not the other stuff that we brought with us. So a lot of our athletes are bringing things with them, along with their vertical jump, along with their fast 40 times, along with their ability to make some dynamic athletic movements. And we want those things, but we're not conditioned to take into account. We sat in their living rooms. We know what type of environment they would come from, right? We recruited them, but we're saying, oh, you leave that where you were, and here you're a student athlete. So I'm going to pause there. And
that was deep. Mind blowing. No pun intended. Mind blowing. Like, seriously, that's literally what you just described too is literally packing a suitcase of stuff, right? Shoving it down. Think about, you put your lotion in and everything, and you put it down and you push it down, and then you sit on it to try to close it, and then you bring it to campus with you, and then all of a sudden it pops open. The lotion is all over this place, your clothes, and you're like, where do I pack everything away? Do I need this shirt anymore? Can I throw that away? And that's where I come in. Like, that's where our team of people come in to say, let's put this over here, throw that away. You don't need that anymore. You're safe now. And we also need to allow the parents and coaches to have that too, that ripple effect to say, you're safe. It's okay. But the coaches also have to feel okay. Don't get me on that layer too. Because coaches also need some mental health. And who do they go to?
You.
They should. They they should. I think that's another layer, a gap there.
Let me ask Dr. Reimer, because not to get too personal, but when you hear when you look at maybe some of your experiences and look at some of the experiences of the athletes, um, do you find you have the ability to empathize more? And and if you, what about those that may not have had some of those challenges?
I think that I went through a lot when I was a kid, and I think that's what you're calling on. I was just really resilient. I think, like, I went through all these things and just kept going. For some reason, it probably didn't have as much of an effect on me as it should have in the present time. And now that that's in the past. So I personally, like, have always struggled with having empathy for what other people are experiencing, to be honest with you. I personally have, because I've always tried to discover that more, if I should say that. And so you asked the question, like, can you teach empathy? I think you can, but people have to have a willingness to try to grow their ability to have empathy. Like, I know that I have tried to grow my ability to have empathy. And in sport, I think a lot of coaches and a lot of people do have empathy. My story and my situation isn't the same, but where I can relate with student athletes and have been able to is the fact that I've been through a lot of crap, and I know that they have. But just because I've been through it doesn't mean that what I've been through is the same as what you've been through. So I have to understand what you've been through in order to be an advocate for what you want to become. I think a lot of coaches, like you said it, they've been in their living room. And you ask a lot of coaches, you ask strength and conditioning coaches, you ask sport coaches, and they're all going to tell you we change lives. So they do have some empathy. They do have empathy for what people have experienced in the past. But the trick is to show empathy for what people are experiencing right now. The number one advice that a mental health professional once told me is, Ernie, all you have to do is stop, look the athlete in the eye, ask them how they're doing, and look at them, let them answer. Don't be preoccupied looking at your phone or doing another job. Just stop and give them a chance to tell you how they're doing and see what happens. And that's the number one advice that someone from my past gave me to start discovering empathy for what people are experiencing right now.
Brittany, what about resilience and grit? Like, that's those are popular terms, and I think people know it's a thing and it's something we need, but how do you get it? How do you teach it?
And that is a great question. I still have, like, I feel that still needs to be studied, because people tell me oftentimes, like, you're so resilient as well. And I'm like, how did I learn that though? I don't really know if it was naturally, like, innate. And then again, when we look at the wellness model, of course, I look at just a social, emotional, spiritual, anybody's belief. So my own beliefs and my own experience, I would say just my spirituality, and, I feel God in me helped guide me through struggles in life. So that was like my ultimate counselor, right? So that was my resilience, and how I reframed that in my life of just struggles, and saying, like, how can I learn from this and grow from it instead of it leaving me stuck? And I don't know if that's something, and everybody doesn't necessarily have that, so finding that hope too is important. So Ted, do you know if there's any, like, studies on resiliency and grit? Because I'm still searching for some to see, and how that it connects to mental health and well-being to date, right? Like, where we are at 2023. I was about to say 2022. I don't even know how we got here in 2020.
I think, if you look at, Duckworth's studies on grit, looking at, I think a lot of it too was with, was it cadets in the military schools that they compared, and who was, who ended up being more successful. but how that would lead to, I don't know if that leads to more, more or less mental health issues. Yeah.
That's good. We need to see that if there's a core, and maybe it's because I'm a military kid too. Maybe that's the connection. I don't know. But I think that's a good question to say, like how that connects with mental health, and how you reframe it. I mean, not to be confused with toxic positivity, right?
Right.
It's understanding and validating, like, yes, we have feelings, things are hard, but how do you overcome that? And to me, that's the definition of mental health. Mental health is defined by how you show up and the tools to overcome stress. To me, that's resilience and grit. That's showing up every day. That's what mental health is. So something to ponder, I think, for everybody to.
Absolutely. Have you dealt with any coaches?
Have I dealt with any coaches as far as like in my, I deal with coaches all the time. So, and each coach has a different background, and how they show up, because I think every sport is unique and different within the athletic culture. So again, layers upon layers, as even Ernie, when he was mentioning swimmers and getting up, I feel like there's a different set of struggles and stressors with each sport, and each coach shows up differently within that sport that they coach. So I have to be able to be multifaceted to understand each individual person that I come into contact with, and understand the unique athletic culture too, and each team dynamic. And each coach shows up even differently as a human being in person versus when they're performing. So when I go to practices and see them in action or games, I'm like, that's not the person I interacted with outside of this space, right? So they're like, we're human beings too, but we also have to perform, and this is our job. So I feel like that is what I realize another layer is, that if sometimes coaches could also feel safe, to where they can see their athletes as humans and not having the fear of like, I'm going to lose my job if I see them as human beings, or that's that pressure, right? The anxiety again, which then causes that, Pat's brewing over there, that ripple effect of just, it spills over, right? They're human beings are human, hurt people, but heal people too.
Yeah. How many times have you had to meet with parents to say, you've got to change your your behaviors. You're driving your kid crazy.
I've
that
had
happen?
Too many to count. Like most of the time, I have the kid or the adolescent in therapy when really it should be the parent. So I'm just putting a Band-Aid to send you back home. I just have to give you coping skills. This is how you could deal with stress while you're in survival mode until you get out of the environment. But a lot of the times it is the parent, because they didn't deal with their own inner child stuff. Again, hurt people. Too many to even count.
Yeah.
Brittany, you said something I think is so profound and deep. I could lose my job if I see you as a human being. Wow. So, wow. And that we're just talking about some coaches, that just some. If I see you as a human being, I could lose my job. So what do I see you as to keep my job? Maybe we shouldn't go there.
Stay tuned. That's one of those but that still goes back to I only see you as the athlete identity, because I have to see that in order to perform. But when I show up to recruit you, I see you as a human, and that's the honeymoon phase, right? That's where I have to show up to recruit you and get you. Once I get you, okay, I already interacted with your family, everybody else, but now is that then that comes off, and the athlete is like, still see me as a human. You saw me as a human when you were with my parents and in my house and all of that. And now all of a sudden I'm just the athlete. So it's a shift, right?
What does that do
A
for?
paradigm shift. so to
Yeah.
speak.
So what does that do for an athlete's mental health?
Identity foreclosure. I talk about this in my dissertation. It's like, okay, well, if I'm only going to get poured into my athlete identity, again, goes back to I'm going to perform to get that self-worth only as an athlete. And then I have until I'm done. And then that's why we struggle with the transition, the grief when athletes are done, that identity foreclosure, because they're like, okay, now my athletic identity is over. And I have to really focus on all my other identities as a human being. And I dropped my mic with that because that was some good stuff. That was some good stuff. This is some big conversation.
Hey, you said drop the mic, and I know Ted probably has one last question for you, but before we get to that, at the beginning of the show, you said that you like to sing, and you just said drop the mic.
I dropped it. I'm not picking it back up.
Over to you, Ted. Over to you.
All right, Brittany, could you recommend 2 books for our listeners?
Ooh, that's only 2?
Well, it's something that, yeah, it could be more than 2, but it's something you've already read or you're currently reading. You think that would enlighten our listeners?
Oh my goodness. So The Body Keeps Score is a good one because we talked a lot about trauma, and that deals with a lot of just the amygdala, learning about how trauma affects your body. And so when we think about the connection between sports science and mental health, I think The Body Keeps Score is a great one. And then Rewiring Your Anxious Brain. That's another good one. Because you can rewire. If we're talking about science, you can rewire your brain. But again, you have to be in a safe space in order for your brain to, again, shrink a little bit. I don't like using the word shrink, but that amygdala, I'll say, to where it's not inflamed, but feeling like I can rest now, right? We talked about sleep too. The Rewiring Your Anxious Brain is a good one too. And that helps with even nutrition and how food, sleep, all of the things we talked about today help rewire it so you can function.
That is amazing. I'm hoping that we were able to rewire some brains today as people, as they get a chance to listen or watch this podcast. This has been an amazing hour. Thank you so much, Ernie, Ted, Dr. Brittany Collins. You're an amazing person. We are truly honored to get to work with you every day, and look forward to much more to come from you and your amazing department in the future. And we want to help everyone else as well. So thank you. You all have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.